What if I told you the world's financial fate, recessions, bailouts, currency crashes, inflation, and even wars, doesn't trace back to governments? Not fully, not even central banks alone. Beneath the surface of global finance lies an empire invisible, unaccountable, and far older than the IMF or World Bank, quietly shaping debt around the world. Imagine an empire so vast that every major sovereign debt crisis in the last century, from Argentina to Greece, from Egypt to Puerto Rico, can be traced back to its influence. An empire that doesn't rule by force, but by the invisible chains of credit and obligation. You've never heard of it? But it might already own our future. Today we're going to unravel it. Welcome to the hidden empire controlling global debt you've never heard about. This is a story of power, patterns, and the price we pay when debt becomes a tool of influence, not just economics. To understand this empire, we must travel back, not to Wall Street, but to a time before modern finance even existed. Long before credit default swaps and quantitative easing, there was credit itself, not just as borrowing, but as a promise of power. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers extended credit to farmers and traders. That credit wasn't neutral. It bound communities to rulers, and rulers to the most powerful lenders of the age. Fast forward to the early modern era, Venice, Genoa, and Amsterdam. These city-states didn't just trade goods, they invented the first sophisticated public debt markets. They borrowed to finance wars, colonies, and expansion. And in doing so, they discovered a truth that would define centuries. Whoever controls credit controls empires. By the 19th century, this power shifted. No longer was wealth held by kings or feudal lords, it was held by financiers in London and Paris, often anonymous, deeply networked, and unbound by national allegiance. These were the proto-banking houses, early precursors to the modern global financial elite. But their story, and the system they helped consolidate, has layers far deeper and far more consequential than most histories admit. Let us start with a simple question. How did private lenders grow powerful enough to influence entire nations? The answer begins in war. In the early 1800s, European states were locked in near-endless conflict. Wars were expensive. Armies cost money, supplies cost money. And crucially, taxes were unreliable. Revenues were unpredictable. So governments turned to private credit, not just for loans, but for continual financing. If a king couldn't pay, the lenders would roll over the debt at a price. This was the birth of sovereign debt markets. And with them, a new dynamic. A government's survival became tied not to taxation, but to its ability to maintain creditworthiness in the eyes of lenders. This wasn't a neutral economic development. It was a shift of power. Instead of citizens holding governments accountable, financial markets did. The most powerful lenders weren't tied to any single nation. Here's where it gets important. These lenders organized, not as governments, not as public institutions, but as networks. You have probably heard about the Rothschilds, a banking family whose branches spanned London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. But they weren't unique, just among the most documented. Across Europe and later the US, strata of bankers, financiers, clearinghouses, and bond markets interlocked, creating what we might call an empire of credit. This empire didn't wear crowns, but it issued credibility, and credibility was currency. By the late 19th century, industrialization was transforming societies. Railroads, factories, urbanization, all required massive capital, far more than governments or local markets could mobilize. Who financed it? Global lenders, the emerging financial empire. These lenders didn't just provide capital, they packaged it as debt, sold it across borders, and created global markets for sovereign and corporate bonds. Here's a turning point. When the US surpassed Britain as the world's largest debtor and creditor, credit became truly global. This wasn't mere economics, it was geopolitics. Debt allowed nations to build infrastructure, fight wars, extend influence, expand empires, but it also created dependence, and that dependence was invisible. Nations gradually learned, if you want investment, you must be creditworthy. If you want creditworthy, you must obey market expectations. Market expectations, not voters, not citizens. Get constitutions. Expectations. What happens when expectations become authority? That's where the story shifts from economics to power. The first great breaking point came with the Great Depression. Governments across the world had borrowed heavily during World War I. After the war, many struggled to repay. Banks failed, currencies collapsed, economies tanked. The result? A crisis of confidence, a sovereign debt crisis. When markets lost faith, credit froze. When credit froze, nations stopped investing. When nations stopped investing, societies fell into crisis. It was the first clear demonstration that creditors, not voters, could dictate outcomes. But the age of Bretton Woods, the IMF and World Bank, was meant to change that, wasn't it? The official story goes like this. After World War II, the U.S. and its allies created global institutions to stabilize the world economy, to prevent another depression, to help reconstruction, to manage debt responsibly. But here's where the twist begins. Instead of reducing the power of private credit, these institutions formalized it. The IMF and World Bank didn't replace lenders, they complemented them. They structured debt in ways that made repayment more enforceable. They imposed conditions. They tied debt relief to policy changes. They tied loans to economic reforms. That's when debt became conditional, not just owed. Countries began to borrow not purely for development, but to avoid default. Default was no longer just a financial failure, it was a political crisis. And so, with each successive crisis, Latin America in the 1980s, Russia in the 1990s, Asia in the late 1990s, Greece in 2010, the pattern repeated. Debt gives crisis, gives structural adjustment, gives loss of autonomy, gives more debt. The power dynamic, once indirect, became systemic. By the 21st century, global debt had mushroomed. Not just sovereign debt, but corporate debt, household debt derivatives, shadow banking, and here's the shocker many people miss. Total global debt now exceeds global GDP. In other words, humanity owes more than it produces every year. This has never happened at this scale before. It means governments borrow to pay interest on old debt, corporations borrow to meet earnings expectations. Households borrow to maintain consumption, investors demand ever higher returns, and the invisible empire. It profits at each step, not just through interest, but through control of liquidity. If a government runs low on cash, who steps in? Central banks. But central banks, including the Fed, ECB, BOJ, are not fully independent from global credit markets. They respond to market pressures. They respond to credit ratings. They respond to bond yields. In essence, markets have become the de facto governors of economies. That's a radical shift and a dangerous one. Over the decades, scholars and policymakers have proposed fixes. Currency transaction taxes, global debt, Jubilee's debt forgiveness programs, alternative clearing currencies, regional financial safety nets. None have fundamentally changed the structure. Why? Because they fail to break the underlying power of credit markets themselves. Debt was never just about money, it was about authority, and authority resists dilution. Every fix so far has softened symptoms, not shifted control. Now, let's bring this into the present. We see the same patterns everywhere. Countries borrowing trillions to just service interest. Private lenders buying sovereign bonds. International institutions imposing conditions. Debt for nature, debt for equity swaps emerging. New blocks forming around alternative credit networks. Every crisis today in Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Asia echoes patterns from a century ago. Not because humans never learn, but because the fundamental incentive structures remain the same. Let us be explicit. The world economy today is more interconnected and more indebted than ever before. Which means the leverage of credit markets over policy has never been stronger. Here's a striking parallel. In the 19th century, European empires enforced influence through trade and military might. In the 21st century, influence is enforced through credit and leverage. Leverage that touches national budgets, social spending, environmental policies, public infrastructure, private sector forecasts, currency stability. The empire is no longer hidden. It's woven into every headline. So, what does all this mean? Let's break it down into 3 clear takeaways. Takeaway number 1. Debt is not just economics. Its power debt historically has been used not just to finance, but to shape policy, influence governance, and enforce compliance. When a nation borrows, it borrows sovereignty too. That's the real currency of credit.
Takeaway number 2.
Financial markets are today's invisible governors' national budgets. Economic reform plans and even social programs are now evaluated first by credit markets, not citizens. Bond yields and credit ratings influence decisions that once fell to parliaments and public debate. That's not democracy, that's market governance. Takeaway number 3. Traditional fixes don't change power structures, cutting interest rates. Debt restructuring, regional alliances. They may reduce pain. They don't break systemic leverage. Long as debt remains central to economic life, the unseen empire retains influence. So here's the real question. Can humanity invent a financial system where debt isn't a tool of control, but a tool of shared prosperity? We've been asking that question for decades, yet the patterns keep repeating. Perhaps it's time we stop asking how to borrow better and start asking why we borrow at all. Because the empire controlling global debt doesn't need armies to command nations. It just needs credit and the willingness of everyone to accept it. If you found this journey enlightening, like, share, and subscribe for deep dives into the hidden forces shaping our world. And let me know in the comments, what do you think is the real solution to global debt? Is it reform, revolution, or something we haven't imagined yet? Until next time, stay curious.